Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Two affective states that Aristotle discusses in the Nicomachean Ethics are closely connected with friendship, but are something different than friendship. One of them is actually, to a certain extent, included in friendship, and one is, you might say, a certain aspect of friendship playing itself out within the political or social realm. And we translate those as goodwill and concord. Goodwill is eunoia, something that Aristotle talked about in Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's something that he also talks about as very important in the rhetoric as one of the key things that gets people believed, being able to display eunoia or goodwill. And concord is homnoia, literally having the same nous, having the same mentality or thinking about something. So like I put here, these are both connected with friendship, but they're not the same as friendship. They're distinct from it. If we look first at goodwill, now Aristotle talked about this in Book 8, and what he has to say in Book 9 is sort of springboarding off of that. Goodwill is an element of friendship, so that it's important that friends actually desire the good for each other. But where goodwill differs from friendship is that you can feel goodwill towards people without actually knowing them. And Aristotle gives the examples of, for example, watching athletes compete in a crowd. Of course, they didn't have television, but I think television is even better for talking about how mediated this is. You may be sitting in a bar watching the game play, and you're rooting for your team, but you don't really know them, even though people have put profiles of them. And this guy's the underdog, and this guy's recovering from an injury, or whatever it is that you want. You feel a sense of goodwill for them. You want them to win, not just because you put money on it or your prestige is at stake. You genuinely desire the good for them. You could even feel that towards the other team, although people might see you as a traitor as a result. But you're not friends with them. Because it's not reciprocated. I mean, they could have a vague sense of goodwill. I want all my fans to do well, but it's not anything that's at the level of a real connection between you. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle says that the goodwill that one person feels towards another person might not even be known to the recipient. So that's very different than friendship, in which there has to be not only goodwill, from one person to the other, it has to be reciprocated. It also has to be known. So friends know each other to be friends. People who have goodwill towards each other don't necessarily know that to be the case. And he says a few other interesting things along this lines. He says, it also has no intensity, nor does it include the same kind of desire. But these things are necessarily involved in affection, philesis, right? So it's not as intense. It doesn't have the kind of, you might say, commitment, right? And like I put here, the person, as Aristotle says, desires the good for the other person, but they're not committed to doing anything about it. So as Aristotle will tell us, spectators conceive goodwill and sympathy for the competitors in a contest, but they're not about to do anything because of it. He says a little bit later, they merely desire the good of those whose well-wishers they are and would not actively assist them to attain it, nor be put to any trouble on their behalf. So, when you think about what goes into, say, clicking like on somebody's post. That might be an expression of goodwill rather than being friends, although Facebook calls you friends quite often when you're doing that sort of thing, doesn't it? But Facebook friends are not necessarily friends in the Aristotelian sense. They could just be people who feel goodwill towards each other, or they might actually be people who feel a kind of facsimile to Concord, as we'll talk about in a moment. So Aristotle is willing to say that goodwill is perhaps the beginning of friendship. He says if people do feel goodwill for each other, and then discover that that's the case, they can, add all the other components of friendship in, and thereby become friends. But the mere fact of having goodwill towards each other, like a speaker displays towards his audience in the rhetoric, right, is not the same thing as being friends, even if you call each other friends. So that's an interesting departure. What about Concord, homnoia? Aristotle says this has to do with sharing the same opinions, doxai, right? But it's not just any sort of opinion, and he tells us why that's the case. He says it's not mere agreement of opinion at all, because this might exist among strangers. So, people that you don't know on the other side of the world might actually think the same things as you about, Indian dishes, or about the fall of the Roman Empire, or, all sorts of things like that. And again, the internet is great for finding those sorts of things out. But that doesn't mean that you have an actual concord with them. And he also goes out and he says, nor is it about just any subject matter whatsoever. For instance, astronomy. To agree about the facts of astronomy is not a bond of friendship. Right? Of course, you could be friends on the basis of you looking in telescopes all the time and going to the planetarium, sending each other articles about the latest thing that's been discovered, but that's not quite the same thing as Aristotle's talking about. Here he's talking about agreement in opinions. And so what kinds of opinions would actually bring us together in this state that he calls concord? Well, it has to do with what is useful for us. We agree about the to sympheron, the useful, that which has utility, that which is helpful, the opposite of which is the harmful, right? And the other things that we agree about are what to choose. He talks about us choosing in the sense of proiresis. We have another video about that if you have any questions about proiresis. He talks about us having the same proiresis and being in agreement about that. We commit the same way. We choose the same way. We might think about this in terms of, political arrangements, as we'll get to as examples in a moment. Also, how to do it, how to implement it, what actually has to be done. And so what we're looking at are the things that matter to us. Aristotle talks in terms of politics, but I think we could also think in terms of society. Where should the roads run? Who should be in charge? What kind of fundamental way of doing things should we have? Do we get on, as we say, on the same page about those sorts of things? In that case, we have concord. Or are we actually fighting each other about this? The opposite of concord is what Aristotle calls stasis, which means something like faction or social breakdown. This is something that happened quite often in ancient Greek city-states, and I think it's something that is, sort of like a permanent state within our own political systems, where we have, sort of rivalries constantly going to town on the same issues. Now, he also tells us that if we understand it in this way, it's kind of a friendly state between fellow citizens, people who have a stake in a political community. We might also think about this in terms of organizations as well, that there could be homnoia or concord within an organization when everybody is in fundamental agreement about what ought to be done and who ought to be in charge, and where the company or the organization ought to be heading, what the point is, and how it implements that point. And so he says that this primarily is going to exist between good people who are able to be friends with each other, and not so much between bad people. He says you can have a little bit of this, but bad people are going to be prone to, watching each other suspiciously to make sure nobody goes over the lines, nobody does what they're not supposed to do. So it's tougher for bad people to be in this state, or be in, you might say, a community of homnoia, the way that good people can. So these two states are, Aristotle thinks, very important to discuss. They're not the same thing as friendship, but they are important within our moral life and our experience. So that is why he wants to tell us about them and distinguish them from friendship.